Hello, everyone. This is the Mind of Lilith, and thank you for joining me for this special astrological presentation about the upcoming solar eclipse in Aries on April 8th. This analysis will focus on the planetary dynamics that are influencing society over the next 6 months. The solar eclipse will occur at 19 degrees of Aries beginning at 1:27 p.m. Central Daylight Time and will travel across the United States from Texas to the northeastern corridor. On the date of the solar eclipse, the North Node is at 15 degrees of Aries, the Sun and Moon are at 19 degrees of Aries, Chiron is at 19 degrees of Aries, and Mercury is at 24 degrees of Aries in retrograde. Mars, Saturn, and Neptune are in the signs of Pisces at 13, 14, and 28 degrees respectively. This eclipse is conjunct the fixed star Ketos, which is associated with maritime accidents, mass immigration, and bad luck caused by reckless, violent, or forceful actions, like what we were seeing in Ecuador with the Mexican embassy. I just noticed that the path of this eclipse is following the path of immigrants being transported from Texas to sanctuary cities in the Midwest and Northeast. Anyway, I think this eclipse will set off a series of unusual and unfortunate geopolitical, geological, and economic events during Taurus season, which will be triggered by the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. I will discuss Taurus season later on this week. So Jupiter is currently in Taurus, conjunct Uranus at 19 and 22 degrees respectively, while Pluto is at 1 degrees of Aquarius. This is an aspect for earthquakes and electromagnetic activity that influences weather patterns. This electromagnetic activity may be caused by the sun or man-made technology like HARP. As a side note, today, April 7th at 7 a.m., I heard strange booming sounds and a flock of birds started flying east, followed by a very thick cloud cover that lasted about an hour. Anyway, the U.S. Army have been seen standing around residential areas and throughout the New York City subway system. So because of all this activity happening in Aries, we also have to take a look at Mars, which is the ruler of Aries. Mars is currently at 13 degrees of Pisces, approaching an exact conjunction with Saturn at 14 degrees of Pisces. Mars just entered Pisces on March 23rd of this year, and a couple days later on March 26th, a cargo ship hit one of the pillars of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, which is a major port for military business and recreational travel. Saturn has been in the house of Pisces with Neptune since March of last year, so it has had some time to set up shop in this space, to decorate the house a little bit, before Mars made its arrival a few weeks ago. In astrology, Mars and Saturn are considered malefics, Mars being the lesser malefic and Saturn being the greater malefic. Both planets are considered malefics because they use destructive methods to dominate, to subjugate, to oppress, and neither planet wants to stand down. Individuals with Mars conjunct square or opposite Saturn can be ruthlessly focused, destructive, and fearless, destroying everything in their path to achieve their goals. Mars is the traditional ruler of both Aries and Scorpio, which is cardinal fire and fixed water respectively, and Saturn is the traditional ruler of Capricorn and Aquarius, cardinal earth, and fixed air respectively. Saturn and Mars are considered enemies because the masculine energy of Mars is rash, impatient, ruthless, arrogant, competitive, angry, which is a stark contrast to Saturn's cool, reserved, and patient energy. Mars uses destruction for destruction's sake. It actually enjoys the chaos that's created by violence and calamity and war, because for Mars, chaos and destruction are necessary for physical and spiritual evolution. Mars represents the pain of reproduction, birth, and transformation, while Saturn represents the pain of toil, sickness, old age, and death. Mars initiates perpetual change, which is usually facilitated through physical, psychological, or existential conflict, while Saturn, the lord of all things material, prefers to use its energy efficiently to build, sustain, and maintain the structures and systems it puts in place to govern the planet. As a feminine energy, Saturn understands that destruction for destruction's sake is ultimately detrimental to cultivating a civilized society through which the energy of all organisms human, plant, and animal, can be efficiently harnessed, hoarded, stashed, and used to amplify its own power. One of the significations of Saturn is slavery. Slavery is a system that uses force to extract and store the energy of humans and animals to create wealth for the slave owners. This wealth is used to protect future generations of that family from the toil of hard work, food insecurity, and enslavement. The reaping and sowing of Saturn takes time, patience, diligence, a concerted effort, and a high level of discipline. Tasks have to be repeated systematically and consistently over a long period of time. One of the reasons why the first iteration of the Roman Empire fell so quickly was because it was too arrogant in nature. War for war's sake, selfishness, corruption, hedonism, debauchery, violence, and misogyny. The second iteration of the Roman Empire is more Saturnian in nature and manages itself as Mars in Capricorn instead of Mars in Aries. Mars is exalted in Capricorn, so even though the ruler of Capricorn, which is Saturn, is considered to be an enemy of Mars, Saturn is wise, intelligent, patient, and experienced enough to use the energy of Mars to achieve its own aims, which is ultimate power over the material world. So for this interpretation, we're going to discuss how Saturnian institutions like banks and corporations and the church are working with the energy of Mars and Neptune to destroy an old system and create a new one that allows them to maintain their dominion over the earth. If you do not respect the rules of Saturn or universal law, you will be under its heel as a slave, a prisoner, and a ritual sacrifice for the principalities that Saturnian institutions are working with. So, Saturn and Pisces. Some of the significations of Pisces are oceans, secrets, ships, drowning, deep places, addiction, escape, deception, and hidden enemies. Saturn has been waiting for Mars in the house of Pisces since last year. And as the taskmaster of this solar system, Saturn knows how to utilize the energies of all planets to achieve its goal of ultimate supremacy, just like these banks, corporations, and religious institutions, especially the Catholic Church. Although Mars and Neptune are both considered enemies of Saturn, they are all in the same house of Pisces, which is ruled by Neptune and Jupiter. So for the time being, they're all on the same accord. This is like the FBI working with the mafia or the CIA working with drug cartels. They're not friends, but they converge based on common interests, which are money and power. So some of the significations of Saturn are suffocation, imprisonment, erosion due to age, slavery, land, financial institutions, drowning even, houses of worship, the papacy, and the law. Mars represents war, conquest, violence, destructive force, and weapons of war. Neptune represents oceans, secrets, darkness, isolated places like hospitals and prisons, and also addictions. Saturn in Pisces may turn water into a wall, which may manifest as a tsunami caused by an earthquake. There is an increased chance of a major earthquake causing a tsunami occurring the next few weeks when the sun enters Taurus. Mars conjunct Saturn can represent a violent attack that may be used to justify war or the physical destruction of a structure or building caused by an accident or weapon. Because Pisces is involved in this interaction, there is something deceptive or secretive about these events. What we're being told is not the entire truth. We may see what is happening with our very own eyes, but the reasons why these things are happening or the explanation given to the public is not necessarily the whole truth. And these events may also be used to justify executing plans that have already been drafted well before these events happened. So Saturn has been preparing for Mars' arrival, and because they're currently in the same sign and house, they will be working together to help Saturn prepare for its conjunction with Neptune and Pisces later next year. At this point, Saturn has introduced itself to Neptune. They've exchanged niceties, but they're currently in different rooms of the same house. Saturn is currently in the room ruled by Jupiter, which is the co-ruler of Pisces, and Neptune is in the room that is ruled by Saturn. So since last year, Saturn has been on a reconnaissance mission getting intel about Pisces that can be used to control Mars and Neptune once they fight it out next year. As a matter of fact, Saturn and Neptune will be fighting so hard that the fight is going to continue into the house of Aries. You ever seen movies where there's this massive brawl and people get thrown through the window out into the street and the fight continues into the next house? This is an analogy for what Saturn and Neptune will be doing from 2025 to 2026. Neptune will be entering Aries before Saturn. So Saturn's plan is to use Mars and Neptune to help prepare for the house that it suffers in the most. Saturn is exalted in Libra and is in its fall in Aries. So at this juncture, Saturn is using this conjunction with Mars to create situations that fortify its power while in the house of Aries, where it knows it will not have the same energetic support it usually has to implement its plans, especially with Neptune setting up shop in his house for 14 years. The next several years will be challenging for Saturn, i.e., long-standing institutions that were built from slavery during the last age. These institutions are in danger of being destroyed, eclipsed, or taken over by other powers. Now, these institutions are in decline due to the influence of Pluto in Aquarius, which represents liberation through science and technology, enlightenment, objectivity, practicality, and camaraderie, not beliefisms perpetuated by politics, Democrat versus Republican, economics, capitalism versus communism, religion, Christianity versus Judaism and Islam and Hinduism, and other systems of stratification that are weaponized by the elites to create divisions among humanity. In the Piscean age, religion was a weapon of war and domination, and in the Aquarian age, technology will be the weapon of war because, as I said earlier, the ultimate goal of the powers that be is always domination and control at the expense of others. So, back to the solar eclipse, okay? A solar eclipse occurs when the Earth traverses between the sun and the moon, casting a shadow over the sun, which creates a halo effect around what appears to be a black hole in the sky. This event is 4 degrees away from the North Node in Aries, which represents war, industrial weapons, and violence. As a result, this eclipse will create a socio-political paradigm shift on the global stage, which is why you see what appears to be infighting among the elites. The axis of influence is shifting to the east and developing nations, and the United States is in the crosshairs of this battle because this landmass, North America, was essentially hijacked. Not just North America, the Americas in general, was hijacked and set up as a penal colony, Saturn, for corporations to farm human beings for industrialized labor, and then to use this land also to extract mineral resources for industrialized production. It appears that the powers that be are intentionally trying to destroy the corporation of the United States to justify shredding the legal framework of the constitutional republic, which has some consideration for human rights. But as we can all see, as the Aquarian age progresses, the elites will attempt to bionize human beings, turning them into androids that can be used as slaves to extract an almost endless supply of blood, hormones, and what some would call loosh to feed interdimensional spiritual parasites. And I'll discuss this later on down the line. So back to the eclipses. Although this eclipse is in the sign of Aries, we have to look at the sign that Mars is in, Pisces, okay? While we're dealing with Pisces, there is an element of deception, confusion, and obfuscation. Neptune, Saturn, and Mars are all in Pisces, which means that the destructive actions of Mars, which will be the military or some sort of terrorist or could be reckless accidents, will be used by Saturnian institutions to perform a ritualistic sacrifice that will be implemented to fortify Saturn's institutional power in the Aquarian age. In other words, whatever calamity happens over the next year will be used as an opportunity for legacy institutions, churches, corporations, and banks to create laws, Saturn, that keep humanity enslaved, Saturn, and also Pisces. Neptune in Pisces wants liberation from the third dimension. This is the energy of dreams, escapism, drugs, addiction, and suicide with Jupiter. With Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces, liberation is the ultimate aspiration for the collective consciousness, and Saturn does not want this. So Saturn, aka the government, churches, banks, institutions, religious institutions, will use a Martian event like a war, terrorism, or even an accident, some sort of destruction, to institute laws that will protect the integrity, which means the strength, stability, and functionality of these old institutions that are designed to enslave human beings by any means necessary. If you refuse to be enslaved, you will be destroyed or wander aimlessly like nomads, gypsies, vagabonds, hobos, and you'll be at the mercy of the elements or the state, as we can see with Black Americans in the United States. So we have Mars conjunct Neptune now, right? Mars is going to reach Neptune before Saturn does. Neptune and Jupiter actually really enjoys Mars energy, which is one of the reasons why we have maritime law or the law of the sea versus common law, civil law, the law of the land. These are two separate jurisdictions, okay? So Mars conjunct Neptune can create the fog of war or deception as a weapon of war. This conjunction is usually very powerful because Neptune can use the masculine, forceful energy of Mars to execute its plans. based on belief systems. Neptune's influence is actually very hypnotic, subtle, seductive, and addictive. This is the energy of the siren, or Niagara Falls, where thousands of people have committed suicide as an act of surrender to the glorious beauty of nature. In relationships, significant aspects between Neptune and Mars will have one person completely smitten with their partner, and this person will happily destroy themselves to prove how much they love the person. They will sacrifice themselves, Neptune, to prove how much they love the person that they're with. Neptune Mars connections consider ritual sacrifice and honor. The theme song for Neptune Mars conjunctions or connections aspects is Prince's I Would Die For You. Some of these people feel honored to be able to die for someone they love, someone they're attracted to, someone they worship. That's just what it is with this aspect. So Neptune and Jupiter govern our beliefs, and with Mars in connection with these two planets, weak-minded people are really willing to kill or die for their beliefs with no fear, guilt, or compunction, because in their minds, they're doing the right thing in the name of their religion or a person, a celebrity, their politics, or some sort of economic system, right? This happened during the Vietnam War, where millions of people were killed to stop communism, so to speak. This also happened during the war on drugs, where the U.S. government poisoned millions of Americans with heroin and crack cocaine. When Mars is interacting with Neptune or Jupiter, the lust for power increases significantly, and the methods that are used to secure that power become more extreme, violent, selfish, reckless, destructive, and even desperate. And I'll talk about desperation later on in this presentation. So, Mars conjunct Neptune creates religious fanatics, fascists, racists, fundamentalists, mass deaths, and Holocaust because of belief systems. In my opinion, Neptune conjunct Mars can be more destructive than Mars conjunct Saturn, because with Neptune, there are no limits to the extremes that people are willing to go to force their beliefs on others. And unlike Neptune, Saturn does not like to waste energy. Instead of a mass genocide, Saturn prefers mass enslavement or even starvation, because Saturn is also starvation too. Neptune and Mars does not consider mass genocide an issue, because Neptune nor Mars has the capacity to officially manage systems like slavery over a long period of time. So if the people are erased, then there's nothing to manage. Now again, Saturn does also represent starvation, but this is a long cycle. This is a long period of time where you can slowly starve out a population, like what's happening in Gaza. But this is happening in Gaza because of fundamentalist beliefs, right? So starvation is, on the one hand, an aspect of Saturn, but Neptune is being used, or belief systems are being used to facilitate the starvation. So Zionism is the reason why the Gazans and Palestinians are being starved, right? Neptune and Saturn working together, okay? When the planets are in the same signs, they actually work together to achieve a common goal. So it's not a coincidence that the situation that's happening in the Middle East right now started taking place while Saturn entered Pisces, which is conjuncting or getting close to Neptune. This is starvation and war and oppression and domination for an ideology or belief system, which in this case is Zionism. Now, this has happened on every single continent. On every continent, there have been mass genocides, mass suicides, mass murderous events, Holocaust on every single continent, because human beings, by and large, are very stupid. And this presentation may trigger some people. That's okay. You guys will survive. But by and large, people are easily influenced by what they believe in, some ideology. They're easily brainwashed and manipulated into doing things that will destroy other human beings. So, Neptune and Mars does not consider mass genocide an issue, because Neptune nor Mars has the capacity to efficiently manage a system like slavery, which can be generational, right? And it's very sophisticated, especially in the case of chattel slavery, which is industrialized or corporatized slavery. So if there are no people, though, with Neptune and Mars, if there's nobody because everybody's been killed off, they've been starved to death, they've been slaughtered or bombed to nothing, then there's nothing to manage long term, right? And we saw this during the Christian Crusades, where millions of indigenous natives were slaughtered to propagate Catholicism. We also saw this with Joseph Stalin. He killed and starved tens of millions of Russians to foster communism. Now, for those of you who do not know, Stalin was a Sagittarius with Neptune opposite Mars. So Sagittarius is the sign of the extremists, the fundamentalists. And I'm going to get into that at some point down the line. But yeah, anyway, when Mars conjuncts Neptune. Saturnian institutions will use deception to create confusion after chaotic or destabilizing events. Since you haven't noticed, when Neptune entered Pisces in 2011, since then, fanaticism and extremism and a stratification or identity politics has been used as a weapon by the elites. We had the whole LGBT conversation. Now we have the woke movement. Then we have SJWs. We have Democrat versus Republican. The country has been deliberately polarized by the powers that be to keep us divided and separated to the point where we can't see what's going on and what they're doing against us. Division is the methodology used to maintain control among the masses, okay? Since Neptune entered Pisces in 2011, fanaticism and extremism has increased throughout the world, which is setting the stage for what Saturn has been planning to do all along. Another example of Mars conjunct Neptune is lying about weapons of mass destruction to justify killing 1 million innocent people. This conjunction is, what makes someone use a planned terrorist attack to justify committing genocide. This is what's happening in the Middle East right now, and it's also happened during World War II. The Japanese were tricked into attacking Pearl Harbor so that the U.S. military could justify dropping 2 atomic bombs, incinerating hundreds of thousands of Japanese and poisoning millions of other Japanese with radiation. And this bombing also helped the U.S. government set up institutions and businesses and banking in Japan that benefited the United States. Saturn, right? Mars conjunct Neptune can also manifest as a naval attack that is used to instigate an ideological war, which will ultimately be used to protect the interests of the corporations and religious institutions, especially the Church of England and the Catholic Church. Because Mars and Saturn are in the sign of Pisces, water may also be used as a weapon to cause excessive flooding, tsunamis, rainstorms, etc. When Saturn conjuncts Neptune in Pisces, we will see the government using deception to pass laws that limit the freedom of the collective for the benefits of legacy institutions that depend on our blind obedience and slavery to exist. As I mentioned earlier, Neptune represents liberation, escapism, beliefs and ideologies, and also spirituality. Saturn will make a conjunction to Neptune after Mars makes a conjunction to Neptune. And so this can manifest as a religious institution, Saturn, using chaos and war, Mars, to create laws that obstruct people's freedoms, Neptune and Pisces. The veil will be lifted. The veil is Pisces, and people will see who the Wizard of Oz truly is. This will not happen, all this won't happen on the exact date of the solar eclipse. These events will play out in the months and years after this eclipse. And this eclipse is a catalyst because it's conjuncted the North Node. Keep in mind that the Catholic Church is a cardinal institution using war, Aries, the law, Libra, birthright, death, Cancer, and slavery, Capricorn, to maintain power over everybody on this planet or over Christians at the very least, okay? This solar eclipse is a catalyzing event that will activate the transitional period for humanity as we enter a new paradigm. Technology has given human beings the freedom to think for themselves, which is a threat to Saturnian institutions that use work, slavery, ignorance, and imprisonment to suppress and oppress humanity in order to maintain control, which again is always the ultimate objective. Every single thing they do is to maintain control over you and your life force. The church, the mosque, the synagogue, corporations, governments, banks will use any means necessary, including terrorism, weaponized warfare, unfettered immigration, even destroying its own consumer citizens who pay taxes for the privilege of being a slave. These institutions will do anything to maintain power. So please keep that in mind in the upcoming days, weeks, months, and years when laws are passed that do not benefit the average citizen, but are designed to protect corporate interests, which ultimately benefit these religious institutions. Okay, in closing, as I mentioned earlier, excessive and gratuitous violence is usually an act of desperation. When the KKK terrorized Black Americans, they were desperate to protect the land that they stole using adverse possession and squatters' rights. They were willing to torture, maim, frame, burn, and destroy anything that gave Black Americans autonomy, which is perceived as a threat to the Saturnian institutions because these institutions are using the enslavement of Black Americans and other citizens to exist. Saturn also represents abandoned lands, landlords, and tenants. Black Americans abandoned, quote unquote, their lands when the Catholic Church and the Church of England classified them as chattel or property. Property cannot own property. The first thing the church did was Christianize indigenous peoples with surnames that were property of the church, which made them property of the church. As long as Black and indigenous people have Christian surnames, they belong to the church, either the Church of England or the Catholic Church, especially if you're Hispanic, okay? As long as Black and indigenous people have Christian surnames, or whoever has a Christian surname belongs to the church. Not only do they belong to the church, all of their inheritance, their culture, their inventions, their children, and the land of their ancestors belongs to the church. This is why inventions created by slaves were patented in the name of their slave owner. The U.S. Patent Office opened in 1790. Why so soon? Why so soon? This is why, again, our inventions were taken by the slave owner, and their children are benefiting off of the labor and the ingenuity and the intellect and the energy of our ancestors. Once the Catholic Church and the Church of England changed our names, they also changed our relationship to our land and made us tenants on our own property, which puts us in perpetual slavery. And now many of us are gypsies on our own land. Black Americans make up most of the homeless population in the United States, and every Black American that is ADOS or FBA has a story of how the government or colonial settlers took family land through adverse possession, eminent domain, or squatters' rights. Squatters' rights laws were used by European colonial settlers to steal land from indigenous Americans, which they could only do after we were anglicized or Christianized with European surnames. Once we were forced to take those names, the Catholic Church and the Church of England flooded this country with colonial settlers, saying that the land was empty and abandoned, just like the Zionists are doing in Gaza right now, and just like the conquistadors did in Latin America, just as the British did in Australia. Do you notice that they all have the same story? Nobody was here when we traveled to the land. Nobody was here when we discovered the land, right? Nobody was here when they arrived. That means to them the land was abandoned, right? But that's a technicality. The land was legally abandoned once we changed our name. So even though we're physically on the land, our names being changed means that we're property of the Catholic Church. We are living on the church's land, right? You abandoned your land when they anglicized you with a Christian name. This is why they say they civilized us, which means that they made indigenous people citizens of Rome when they forced their names onto us. In the book of Mark, chapter 12, verse 17, it says, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's.'" As long as you have a Christian or Catholic or anglicized name, you are a citizen of Rome. You're a citizen of England, of the Church of England, but you're not a citizen. You don't have any more sovereign or human rights. You have civil rights, but no sovereign or human rights, okay? The home of all Christians is Rome, not Australia, not the Americas, not New Zealand. Your legal home is the Catholic Church or the Church of England, right? This is Saturn or Kronos, who eats its own children. Remember, the Pope represents the Holy Father, right? Father representing Saturn. Saturn dealing with the church. The church or Saturn or Kronos eats its own children. The church has been eating its own citizens for centuries now. This is why nobody can afford anything anymore. We all got to pay taxes until we die. And then the property that we have worked hard for and toiled over for decades, it can be taken from us if we don't pay taxes on it, even after the mortgage is paid off. So you don't own anything. All of this belongs to, so to speak, belongs, quote unquote, to the church. That's why they forced indigenous people to carry their name, okay? So we Christian citizens have to pay taxes for the privilege of living on land that has been stolen by the church in your name. The European colonial settlers know this, which is why many of them still have a visceral hatred for Black Americans, not other foreigners. Our very existence delegitimizes their claim to our state, which is a land that the church stole for the purpose of creating this slave colony. But compared to the conditions that many Europeans were living in Europe as peons, paupers, feudals, slaves, gypsies, courtesans, concubines, whatever, the Americas was a paradise for them, especially since they were deputized by the church and the state for the sole purpose of securing stolen indigenous property. Over the next several months, you will see more states outlawing squatters' rights to protect the millions of empty residential properties that have been purchased by large corporations, which was the ultimate goal of the Church of England and the Catholic Church. turn indigenous land into corporate property in perpetuity to force people to pay for the privilege of being born on this planet. The Catholic Church wants everyone to pay for the right to exist because this institution believes that it owns the planet and all its inhabitants are renters, especially if you have access to technological conveniences. This level of hatred for human beings comes from entities that are not human. And I will explain why I believe this in the near future. So here's a trick bag. The churches that have been involved in this scam own the European settlers too. They use the poor, unwashed masses of Europe to commit genocide against the natives through land theft. Land theft is an act of genocide, period. So now that this illegitimate Ponzi scheme is collapsing, the church is disempowering or they are radicalizing the European settlers who call themselves white people because, one, they don't need them anymore, and two, they are in the way of the new system that's being created. If you take it to the very top, the churches are responsible for the drugs flooding into the community, into this country. This is a less conspicuous way of destroying the population. If Americans didn't like to get high and drunk so much, then the government would just bomb us like everybody else, right? So to sum this up, Mars conjunct Saturn in Pisces can cause accidents or violence in the water that causes damage to structures, bridges, ports, ships, etc. This could also elicit violence or unstable weather patterns that cause floods and tsunamis, especially during Taurus season. Because Pisces is a significant influence in this conjunction, there's an element of deception, confusion, or hidden motives involved in these events. The nature of Pisces is sacrifice. Something is being sacrificed to fortify the power of Saturnian institutions like banks, corporations, the military, and religious institutions. The date of the solar eclipse is the catalyst for future events to come while the North Node is in Aries. Saturn will be making a conjunction to the North Node in Pisces next year, which is highly karmic, and some debts will have to be paid. Some karmic debts will have to be paid. And so because, most of these religious leaders, the Pope, the rabbis, whoever, they're also astrologers. So they know what time it is. They've been planning for this for years, okay? You cannot maintain power. You can't stay in power if you don't plan for the future. These people always plan for the future. So they know this was coming before it even started happening. And they have situations put in place to make sure that they can, come out on top. They're not swept under the chaos of this wave of revolution and change that's being caused by these transits, right? So yeah, with all that said, there's nothing to be afraid of. Do not be afraid. I think people seeing things for what they are finally after all this time is a positive thing. I think that the church scrambling for cover after all the BS is done on this planet for centuries is a positive thing. They're desperate and they're afraid because they're losing power. But they want to do something to make sure that they can tip the scales back in their favor. And unfortunately, based on, the way that these people tend to behave, we are going to have to deal with the consequences of whatever they put in place to make sure that they don't lose power. So, yeah. In the coming days, probably before the end of this week, I'm going to do a reading for this Taurus season. A lot of stuff is happening in Taurus season too. That's going to be very interesting. But I'm going to leave it there. I look forward to reading your feedback. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will speak to you soon.